President of the United States had 6 children with the enslaved woman who was the sister of his deceased wife. In September of 1802, a newspaper in Richmond, Virginia, published a report that shocked American society. The President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, the same man who drafted the famous phrase, "All men are created equal," had a long-term relationship with one of his enslaved women named Sally. Several children were born from that relationship. The scandal erupted during his presidency. His political opponents used the revelation to try to destroy him completely. Newspapers printed offensive and vulgar caricatures. Harsh condemnations came from church pulpits. Yet Jefferson chose silence. He neither denied nor confirmed it. He simply said nothing. And that silence lasted for 2 full centuries. What the article did not fully reveal was even more serious. Sally Hemings was not only his enslaved woman, she was also the half-sister of his late wife. They shared the same father. After his wife's death, Jefferson became the owner of Sally, who was then only 9 years old. 18 years later, Sally had given birth to 6 children by the same man. All were descendants of the president, all born into slavery. All had very light skin and could easily pass for white, and all bore unmistakable features of Thomas Jefferson on their faces. The author of the Declaration of Independence ended up forming a hidden family with the sister of his deceased wife. A young woman became connected to the most influential man in America. What led Sally to return from Paris, where she could have gained freedom? How did they share the same household for 38 years without intervention? The key lies in events that began in 1787, when Thomas Jefferson decided to take Sally Hemings to Paris. She arrived in the city at 14 years old, while he was already 44. By law, she remained his property, and there he made a promise that would forever change the course of both their lives. Imagine, a young Sally arrived in Paris at 14 years old, completely alone in an unknown city, and a 44-year-old man, the plenipotentiary minister of the United States, the most powerful person she would ever know. 2 years later, Sally bore their first child. This is the narrative the United States tried to bury for 200 years. The narrative that only DNA evidence finally confirmed. The story of the president and the enslaved woman who turned out to be the sister of his deceased wife. Virginia, United States, 1782. Thomas Jefferson was then 39 years old. He worked as a lawyer, politician, architect, and thinker. 6 years earlier, he had been the principal author of the Declaration of Independence. He enjoyed enormous prestige across the country. He owned a plantation called Monticello, where hundreds of enslaved people worked. He presented himself as a man guided by high principles, or at least that is what he proclaimed. In September of that year, his wife Martha died after giving birth to their 6th child. Jefferson was deeply affected. He remained secluded in his room for 3 full weeks. When he finally emerged, he made a solemn vow. He would never remarry, never seek to replace Martha. He kept that promise, though he found another way to avoid solitude. Martha Wales Jefferson had brought a significant dowry to the marriage: properties, resources, and enslaved people. Among them was the Hemings family, headed by Elizabeth Hemings and her descendants. One of her daughters was Sally. She was 9 years old at the time of Martha's death. She was petite, slender, with very light skin and long, straight hair. She did not fit the typical image of an enslaved person of African origin, because, in fact, she was not entirely so. Her father was John Wales, the same father as Martha, and therefore Jefferson's father-in-law. Sally Hemings was thus the half-sister of Jefferson's deceased wife, and from that moment became his property. Before continuing, we have a small request. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of this content. We would also appreciate it if you left a comment with the country you are following us from. It motivates us greatly to keep sharing stories that deserve to be remembered. Now let us return to the year 1782, to Monticello, to the plantation where Thomas Jefferson had just inherited the 9-year-old sister of his deceased wife, and where, 5 years later, he would make a decision that would transform both their lives forever. Upon Martha Jefferson's death, Thomas inherited all the goods she brought into the marriage, including the Hemings family. Elizabeth Hemings was the central figure of that family. She was 57 years old. She had been enslaved by John Wales, Martha's father. She gave birth to 12 children in total. 6 of them were conceived with John Wales. They were therefore half-siblings of Martha, siblings on the father's side, but enslaved people who carried the same blood as their progenitor. Among them was Sally, who arrived at Monticello at 9 years old. Sally did not perform field labor, which was quite exceptional. Normally, enslaved children began working the land from 6 or 8 years old. However, Sally was assigned to service in the main house. She acted as a maid, helped in the kitchen, waited on the table, tidied rooms, and remained in constant contact with Jefferson's white family. This was also uncommon. Jefferson imposed strict rules about which enslaved people could remain inside the dwelling, but Sally and her siblings were an exception. They were relatives of Martha, descendants of the Wales, and that gave them certain advantages the rest did not enjoy. Years passed. Sally grew up. Jefferson devoted most of his time to political activity. He traveled tirelessly. He was governor of Virginia and later appointed plenipotentiary minister in France. In 1784, he departed for Paris, taking his eldest daughter, Patsy, 11 years old. He left the 2 younger ones in the care of relatives in Virginia. His initial intention was to remain in France for only 2 years, but he ended up staying 5. During that period, he lived in Paris as a diplomat, occupying a distinguished residence on the Champs-Élysées. He participated in dinners with French nobility, frequented philosophers and artists, delighted in European cultural life, although he missed his daughters. In 1787, he decided the time had come to bring Polly, his 9-year-old daughter, to Paris. He wrote to his brother-in-law in Virginia, requesting that the little girl be sent by ship and accompanied by a trustworthy adult woman to watch over her during the 6 weeks of the ocean crossing. However, when the ship docked in London in June of 1787, the person who disembarked with Polly was not an adult. It was Sally Hemings, 14 years old. The ship's captain sent a letter to Jefferson explaining what happened. The woman planned for the trip had fallen ill at the last moment, so the family chose to send Sally instead. The captain added that Sally was a very kind young woman who had taken excellent care of Polly throughout the voyage, and that the girl was in perfect condition and happy. Jefferson received the letter showed no irritation at the unexpected change, and simply arranged the transfer of both from London to Paris. Sally arrived in the French capital in mid-July. The weather was warm and the city overflowed with vitality. For Sally, who had never left Virginia, it was the first time she contemplated a city of such magnitude and with so many people. Jefferson welcomed them into his residence. He hugged Polly and then observed Sally. She was no longer the little 9-year-old he remembered. Now she was 14 years old, tall and slender, with long straight hair, light skin, and delicate features. She resembled someone strikingly, Martha, Jefferson's deceased wife. It was no coincidence. Sally and Martha were sisters, sharing genetic heritage and physical traits. Sally represented a kind of living echo of the past, a presence that evoked the woman Jefferson had loved deeply. Jefferson determined that Sally would remain in Paris. He would not send her back to Virginia. Polly required permanent company, someone to care for her constantly, and Sally would assume that function. However, she also needed training. In France, servants displayed a higher level of refinement than in Virginia. Jefferson paid for French classes for Sally, paid for her to perfect the art of sewing and learn French customs and protocols. For 2 years, Sally resided in Paris, learning, maturing, and inhabiting a city where slavery lacked legal validity. There, enslaved people could claim emancipation before a judge and obtain it. Sally occupied a small room on the upper floor of Jefferson's house. She helped dress Patsy and Polly, accompanied them to classes, made purchases in the markets, and progressively mastered the language. To the neighbors, she was simply a servant, not an enslaved person, since in legal terms, on French territory, she was not. On French soil, Sally was free. She could leave if she wished, remain in the country, seek protection, or begin a different existence. But she was young and alone, without acquaintances, without economic resources, without family except the Jeffersons. Where could she go? During those years, Jefferson spent a lot of time at home. He no longer traveled as much as before. He worked in his study, received visitors, drafted correspondence, and observed. He observed Sally moving through the house. He observed how she assimilated French quickly. He observed how Polly loved her devotedly. He observed how each day she resembled Martha more. In every gesture, every step, every smile. It was like recovering Martha, but in a younger, more fragile version, entirely dependent on him. There is no absolute certainty about the precise moment when their relationship began. The archives do not specify it, the documents are imprecise. But at some point between 1787 and 1789, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings began a long-term relationship. He was 44 years old. She was young. He held the position of United States Minister in France. She remained his enslaved woman. He could act with total freedom. She had very limited options. That is the essence of power. That is the essence of slavery. Even though they were in France, even though legally she was free, the disparity in position between them was so great that her choices were extremely limited. In the fall of 1789, Jefferson received news from the United States. George Washington had been elected president and wished to incorporate Jefferson into his government as Secretary of State. That implied returning to Virginia and leaving Paris. He began organizing the return. He packed books, furniture, papers. He acquired passages for a ship departing in October, 2 for his daughters, 1 for James Hemings, Sally's brother, who worked as his cook, and 1 for Sally. But Sally did not wish to depart. For the first time in her life, she experienced something close to freedom. In Paris, no one treated her as an enslaved person. She could walk the streets unaccompanied, converse with whomever she wanted, imagine a different future. Returning to Virginia would mean the end of all that. She would again be property, again enslaved, lose rights and voice. And there was something additional. Sally was carrying their child. According to the account offered years later by her son Madison Hemings, Sally initially refused to return. She told Jefferson she would stay in France, where she could be free, and where her child would be born free. Jefferson could not legally force her on French soil. Then he resorted to the only thing within his reach. He begged, offered guarantees, assured her that if she returned to Virginia, he would treat her with consideration, grant her privileges, and never assign her to field labor. And, above all, he promised that all her children would be freed upon reaching 21 years old. That was the promise. Freedom not for her, but for the next generation, for her children. Sally was young, carrying a child, isolated, with no one in France except the Jeffersons, without money or shelter. Jefferson's promises represented her only hope, so she accepted. In October of 1789, Sally Hemings boarded for Virginia. She traveled with the father of her child, with the man who was her owner, with the man who had been married to her half-sister. She returned to a life of slavery because it seemed the only visible path. Sally Hemings arrived again at Monticello in November of 1789. No one asked questions. The enslaved people knew it was better to remain silent. Jefferson's white family did not inquire either. If they harbored suspicions, they chose silence. Sally was again assigned service in the main house, not in the fields or the enslaved kitchens, near Jefferson, near his daughters, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed completely. In 1790, their first child was born. There is no record of the name or exact date, only a brief notation in Jefferson's papers recording the birth of a baby. Shortly after, another note appears. The child died weeks later. The cause is unknown. Childhood illnesses were frequent and mortality high, especially among enslaved people. Sally was young and had just lost her first child. Jefferson made no mention of it in his private correspondence, neither of the birth nor of the death, as if it had never happened. Jefferson assumed the position of Secretary of State during George Washington's presidency. That forced him to spend long periods in Philadelphia, then the seat of the capital, although he returned to Monticello regularly, every few months, staying weeks or even entire months. And every time he returned, Sally was there, waiting for him, working, residing in a small room in the south wing of the plantation, adjacent to Jefferson's. That was not usual. Enslaved people did not occupy rooms next to their owners. But Sally was not just any enslaved person, and at Monticello everyone understood that. In 1795, a girl named Harriet was born. She had extremely light skin, capable of passing for white. She displayed Jefferson's features, the eyes, the shape of the face. Anyone who saw them together could have noticed, but no one mentioned it. Harriet lived only 2 years before dying. Again, no record of the cause. Again, Jefferson remained silent about it. 2 children lost. Sally continued in slavery. In 1798, a boy named Beverly came into the world. This time, the child survived. He grew up healthy and strong, with light skin like his sister and Jefferson's features. Beverly did not work in the fields. He worked as a carpenter and musician. He resided in the main house, not in the enslaved cabins. He received different, better treatment because everyone knew who his father was, although no one said it openly. In 1799, another girl was born. No record of her name survives. The baby died in infancy. 3 children deceased, 1 alive. In 1800, another girl, also named Harriet, in memory of the first who had died. This Harriet survived. She was beautiful, with very light skin, straight hair, and blue eyes. She did not appear to be enslaved. She looked like a white child from a well-off family, and in part she was. That same year, Thomas Jefferson was elected President of the United States. He moved to Washington, D.C., occupied the White House, but continued returning to Monticello every few months, staying weeks or months, especially in summer, when the heat in the capital was unbearable. And every time he arrived, Sally waited for him. During those years, Jefferson was the most powerful man in America. But at Monticello, in that small room adjacent to his, lived his secret. The plantation enslaved people knew it. The neighbors intuited it. Visitors noticed the light-skinned children who resembled the president, but no one expressed it publicly, until someone did. In September of 1802, a journalist named James Callender published an article in the Richmond Recorder newspaper. Callender had been Jefferson's ally and supported him politically, but they had broken relations after a dispute. Callender sought revenge and had the ideal story to damage him. The text claimed that President Jefferson kept one of his enslaved women named Sally as a close companion, that he had had several children with her, that those children resided at Monticello, that they resembled Jefferson remarkably, and that in Virginia everyone knew it, although no one dared say it. Callender included concrete details, names, ages, descriptions. He did not invent. He related what he had heard, what many knew, what no one had dared publish. The scandal erupted with force. Newspapers across the country reproduced the information. Jefferson's political opponents, mainly the Federalists, used the article to attack him mercilessly. They spread gross caricatures, wrote satirical poems, and branded him a hypocrite. They argued that the author of "All Men Are Created Equal" had children born into slavery, that the nation's president had a hidden family with an enslaved woman, that he was an impostor, a deception, a man lacking morals. Jefferson did not reply. He never denied the article, never confirmed it. He chose absolute silence. His daughters came to his defense, assuring it was impossible, that their father would never do such a thing, that the light-skinned children at Monticello were sons of Jefferson's nephews, not his, and that Callender lied out of spite. But Jefferson himself never uttered a single public word about Sally Hemings, neither denial nor admission. The most eloquent man in America, the author of the Declaration of Independence, kept silent for 36 years. Not a single word. No denial, No explanation, no attempt at defense. That silence was his loudest confession. Over time, the scandal faded. Jefferson was re-elected in 1804, completed his second term, and continued traveling to Monticello, continued seeing Sally, continued having children with her, because power shielded him. And Jefferson possessed all the power. Sally, none. In 1805, a boy named Madison was born. It was her fifth living child. Beverly was 7 years old, Harriet 4. Madison grew up aware of who his father was. Years later, as an adult and free, he gave an interview to a newspaper in which he related the whole truth. He affirmed that his father was Thomas Jefferson, that his mother was Sally Hemings, that he had grown up at Monticello knowing it, that everyone there knew it, that no one commented on it openly, but that it was true. In 1808, Sally gave birth to her last child, named Eston. He was the lightest-skinned of all, capable of passing completely for white. Years later, upon obtaining his freedom, he changed his surname and presented himself as Eston Hemings Jefferson. He adopted his father's surname, the one that legally never belonged to him, but which belonged to him by blood lineage. Sally Hemings had 6 children with Thomas Jefferson. 4 reached adulthood: Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston. All light-skinned, all with Jefferson's features, all born enslaved. Because the law established that children inherited the mother's condition, the father's identity did not matter. If the mother was enslaved, the children were. Even if the father was the President of the United States, even if the father had written that all men are created equal. The law was unequivocal and protected men like Jefferson, never women like Sally. After the scandal of 1802, Thomas Jefferson completed 2 full presidential terms, 8 years. During that period, he traveled frequently between Washington, D.C. and Monticello. He spent months in the capital and then returned to Virginia. Every time he returned, Sally was there. The scandal changed nothing. Jefferson did not sell her, did not send her away, did not end the relationship. He simply continued as if nothing had happened, because he could, and no one had the capacity to stop him. In 1809, Jefferson concluded his presidency. He was 66 years old and tired of political life. He returned to Monticello to remain there during his final years, with his white family and with Sally. She was 36 years old and had spent half her existence with Jefferson. She had had 6 of his children, lost 2, and raised 4, and she remained his enslaved woman. The routine at Monticello was peculiar. Jefferson inhabited the main house with his white daughters and grandchildren. Sally occupied a small room in the south building, connected to the house by a passageway. Her children lived nearby. Beverly worked as a carpenter. Harriet helped in the house. Madison and Eston were still young. All worked, but not like the rest of the enslaved people. Not in the fields under the scorching sun. Not under the overseer's whips. They performed tasks in the house, learned specialized trades, and enjoyed privileges that the more than 300 enslaved people at Monticello did not have. Visitors noticed the light-skinned children and asked who they were. The enslaved people responded evasively, "They are part of the Hemings family. They are good workers. They have white blood," but never specified whose. Everyone knew, but no one said it aloud. It was a shared secret that all protected. because Jefferson embodied power. Jefferson was respected. Pronouncing the truth publicly would have meant destroying everything. A man named Isaac Jefferson, who worked many years at Monticello, gave an interview years later. He spoke of life on the plantation and mentioned Sally Hemings. He said she was the personal maid to Jefferson's daughters, that the family appreciated her greatly, that she never worked in the fields, and that she was always near Mr. Jefferson. But Isaac did not describe her as Jefferson's companion. He did not claim her children were his, although obviously he knew, because everyone knew. Jefferson's white daughters also knew, or at least suspected. They saw the Hemings children daily. They observed their resemblance to their father. They noticed the privileges they received. They saw how Sally lived in a room next to Jefferson's, but they never mentioned it. Years later, after Jefferson's death, his granddaughters flatly denied the entire story. They assured it was impossible, that their grandfather would never have done such a thing, that the Hemings children were sons of Jefferson's nephews. They constructed that version and upheld it for decades because acknowledging the truth implied accepting that their grandfather had had a family with an enslaved woman, that he had kept the sister of his deceased wife in a long-term relationship. It was too humiliating, too painful. They preferred to deny and trust that no one could prove otherwise. Years passed. Jefferson aged. He accumulated immense debts. The plantation no longer produced enough. He had lived beyond his means for decades, buying books, building structures, importing wines, collecting art, all financed with loans. By 1826, he owed the equivalent of more than 2 million current dollars. He knew that upon his death, Monticello would have to be sold. The enslaved people would be sold. Everything would collapse. His white family would be ruined. But there was something he could still decide: which enslaved people to free in his will. Virginia law authorized owners to manumit enslaved people upon death. Jefferson had freed very few in life. But now, aware of his proximity to death, he had to choose. He decided to free 5 enslaved people, only 5 out of the more than 100 he still owned. 2 were Sally's brothers, the other 3 his own sons, Beverly, Madison, and Eston. Thus he fulfilled the promise made to Sally 37 years earlier in Paris. But he did not free Sally. During 38 years of relationship, 6 children, decades sharing the same household, he never gave her freedom. Even on his deathbed, he preferred to free 5 other people rather than the mother of his own children. Sally Hemings died legally an enslaved woman of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson died in his bed at Monticello. He was 83 years old. He had led an exceptional life. He drafted the Declaration of Independence, was governor, minister, vice president, president. He founded the University of Virginia. He was considered one of the greatest men of America, one of the founding fathers, a genius, a visionary, a hero. He died the same day as John Adams, the second president. It was interpreted as a sign of destiny, 2 prominent figures dying simultaneously on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Newspapers published panegyrics, exalted his greatness, his legacy, his relevance to the nation. No one mentioned Sally Hemings. No one spoke of the 6 children he had with her. No one remembered that he had maintained a 37-year relationship with his enslaved woman, that that woman was the sister of his deceased wife, that he had promised to free his children, but not their mother. All that was omitted, buried, forgotten. because it was not the narrative America wanted to tell about Thomas Jefferson. It was not the narrative that made him a hero. Thus, that story faded away. It became rumor, whispering, something respectable people avoided mentioning. And it remained so for almost 200 years. Sally Hemings did not receive formal manumission, but after her father's death, Jefferson's daughter Martha allowed her to leave Monticello. Sally moved to Charlottesville, the nearest city. She lived with her sons Madison and Eston. She was 53 years old. For the first time in her life, she did not reside at Monticello, did not serve the Jefferson family, belonged to no one. She was free in practice, although legally she remained enslaved until her death. Sally Hemings lived 9 more years and died in 1835 at 62 years old. In the 1830 census, 5 years before her death, she was recorded as a white woman, not mulatto, not black, but white. Her children also appeared recorded as white. They had crossed the color line. They had become what their skin allowed them to be. They had escaped slavery not only legally, but also socially. They became white, and with that, erased their link with Sally, with Jefferson, with all that history, because it was the only way to survive, the only way to achieve full freedom. The 4 children of Sally Hemings who reached adulthood followed different paths after obtaining their freedom. All had skin light enough to pass for white, and all took advantage of that circumstance to evade slavery in ways others could not. Beverly Hemings disappeared in 1822. He was 24 years old. One day he simply left Monticello and never returned. Jefferson noted in his records that Beverly had fled, but sent no one to search for him. He let him go. He fulfilled his promise in a peculiar way. Beverly went north, married a white woman, and lived as a white man. He had descendants. His descendants never knew they carried African blood. They never knew their great-grandfather had been Thomas Jefferson. Beverly deliberately erased that history. It was the only way to be truly free. Harriet Hemings also left in 1822. She was 21 years old. Jefferson provided her enough money for the trip. Harriet moved to Washington, D.C., married a white man, and lived as a white woman. She had children. Her family never knew the truth. Harriet preserved the secret until her death, because revealing it implied losing everything, being rejected by her husband, her children being classified as black, returning to social slavery. She preferred silence, just as her mother had chosen it throughout her existence. Madison Hemings was different. He was formally freed by Jefferson's will in 1826. He was 21 years old. He remained in Virginia, married a free black woman, and had children. He lived as a black man. In 1873, at 68 years old, he gave an interview to a newspaper. He related the whole story. He affirmed that his father was Thomas Jefferson, that his mother was Sally Hemings, that Sally had been in a long-term relationship with Jefferson for 37 years, that all his siblings were Jefferson's children, that he had grown up at Monticello knowing that reality, that it was no secret to anyone who lived there. Madison was the only one who proclaimed the truth publicly, the only one without fear, the only one who did not hide. Eston Hemings was also freed in 1826. He was 18 years old. He remained in Virginia for a time, married, and had children. But in 1852, he decided to move to Ohio and, in doing so, changed his surname. He presented himself as Eston Hemings Jefferson. He adopted his father's surname, the one that legally never belonged to him, but which belonged to him by blood. In Ohio, Eston and his family lived as white. His children married white people. Eston's descendants never knew they had African blood, but they always knew they descended from Thomas Jefferson. They preserved that part of the history. The part concerning Sally they eliminated. After Jefferson's death, his white family denied the entire story for more than 150 years. They assured it was impossible, that Jefferson would never have had a relationship with an enslaved woman, that the Hemings children were sons of his nephews, not his. They elaborated explanations to justify the evident resemblance to Jefferson, that families resemble each other, that cousins share features, that it was mere coincidence. They questioned Madison Hemings's veracity. They said he lied, that he sought notoriety, that he wanted to link himself to a famous name. Jefferson's white family defended his reputation for decades, and America believed them because no one wanted to accept that a founding father had had a family born into slavery. Historians also rejected the story for a long time. They argued there was not enough evidence, that Madison Hemings' testimony was unreliable, that enslaved people lied, that Jefferson was a man of principles and would never have acted that way. Some admitted it was possible, but most denied it, especially those who admired Jefferson and had dedicated their careers to studying his legacy. Acknowledging the truth about Sally Hemings implied accepting that Jefferson was a hypocrite, that the author of Equality had kept his own children in slavery. It was too disturbing. That is why the story was ignored, minimized, denied. But in 1998, everything changed. A team of scientists conducted DNA analysis on descendants of Eston Hemings and members of the Jefferson family. The results were conclusive. 172 years after Jefferson's death, science forced America to look at what for almost 2 centuries it had refused to see. Historians, descendants, the Monticello Foundation itself, all repeated, "This cannot be true." Only the DNA in 1998 forced them to admit reality. In the year 2000, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, responsible for administering Monticello as a museum, published an official report. They recognized the relationship, recognized the children, recognized that the story they had denied for so long was real. They modified the exhibitions at Monticello. They incorporated information about Sally Hemings, about her children, about the room where she lived, about the promise Jefferson made her in Paris, about the 37 years they shared, about the fact that he never freed her. Thomas Jefferson died as one of the great men of America. Sally Hemings died as a forgotten, former enslaved woman. Her children achieved freedom, but had to hide or deny their origin to live in peace. Some chose to be white, others black, but all carried the weight of a secret that America refused to accept. The secret that the man who wrote that all men are created equal had 6 children with his enslaved woman, never publicly recognized them, never freed them before 21 years old, and never freed their mother. This is the story that America buried for 200 years. The story that only science could confirm. The story of the president and the enslaved woman, of power and powerlessness, of hypocrisy and survival, of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings and the 6 children born in the shadow of the most powerful man in America.